My name is Perry, and welcome to the Literary Knitterary. Alright friends, apologies for coming to you with 2 tag videos in a row, but I didn't want to let the midpoint of the year recede too far behind me before I did this video, which is of course the mid-year book Freakout tag. I will of course link the original creators of the tag in the description down below. In the first half of 2020, I believe that I read exactly 78 books, which might be kind of a weird number to say exactly about because it's not a terribly round number, but it is the number that I set my Goodreads goal to at the beginning of the year, so it felt really good to accomplish that right about the halfway point of the year. Of those 78 books, there have of course been some highlights and some lowlights, so without any further ado, let's get into the tag questions. Something I discovered while I was preparing for this tag was that I kind of have a really hard time picking superlatives, like a tag like this that just comes out and asks you, what's the best book you've read so far in 2020? It feels like there's more pressure on that answer than at the end of the year making a top 10 list or something, because even though you do rank the books in a top 10 list, they all get to be mentioned and talked about, whereas just saying what's the best book you've read so far in 2020 makes me a little bit nervous because there are some really quality books that I'm not going to be able to talk about if I just talk about my favorite, and it's a mess. But anyway, question number 1 is the best book you read in 2020, and for this I'm going to go with my favorite book and mention If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. I read this just last month and it was so much of everything that I ever want in a book. It's a dark academia novel set at a Shakespeare acting program at a prestigious conservatory, and we follow these 7 students who keep getting typecast, keep being asked to play the same roles, and the tensions and relationships within their group have been building and growing and shifting over the course of the past 4 years, and over the course of the book they eventually build up to murder. I'm mentioning this book for this question because I feel like it does a really good job of providing me exactly what I like in a book, but also being genuinely interesting and exploring interesting questions skillfully. The writing is good. I really loved every second of reading this book, and it was one of those books where you have a sort of a book hangover right after you finish, where you just kind of have to sit there and like stare at the wall and like think about it. I just really enjoyed it and thought it also had the objective quality to back it up. I kind of want to give honorable mentions here, but I think I will end up mentioning my honorable mentions at other points in this tag, so I will refrain. Question number 2 is the best sequel you have read so far in 2020, and I actually had precious little to pick from here. I haven't read a lot of sequels, but even if I did have a larger pool to pick from, I think I still would have picked Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shauna Maguire, which is the second book in the Wayward Children series. I think this would have won best sequel anyway because I liked it even better than the first book. Why is that? It was because from the second that the character of Jack was introduced, I was a huge sucker for that character. I don't know what Shauna Maguire did. I don't think anyone's ever made me fall in love with a character that quickly, but basically as soon as that character appeared on the page, I was like, oh, we're best friends now. And so to have the second book be focused more around Jack than the first book I liked it even better. I liked this sort of dark and gothic mood. The book was an interesting case where I remember I was listening to it in the car, and I got out of the car and I went inside and I told my boyfriend exactly how the book was going to end. And then I got back in the car and drove away the next day and listened to the ending of the book. And even though I knew how the book was going to end and it played out exactly the way that I said it was going to play out, I cried. So make of that what you will. I've seen people say that they dislike these books because, or that an element of these books that they dislike is the fact that they can feel a little bit preachy or very obvious with their thematic content. And I definitely feel that, but it didn't like ruin the book for me to have the author basically just tell you what she's thinking about. And again, the fact that I could sort of predict how the plot was going to play out didn't diminish my enjoyment, my emotional involvement in the book at all. Jack is an amazing character, and I really need to continue on with the series as the year progresses. Question number 3 is a new release you haven't read yet but want to, and I don't know if this is just my perfectionistic streak causing problems for me again, but I also feel nervous about the new release questions because I feel like I don't have a comprehensive enough knowledge of what's being released at any given point to give one answer. So there are a bunch, but I want to mention The Boy in the Red Dress by Kristen Lambert, both because it is very precisely up my exact alley and because I feel like I haven't seen a lot of people talking about it. This came out in May, on May 12th, I believe, and it's basically a young adult historical fiction murder mystery set at like a queer underground nightclub in the 1920s, and the main character is a bi girl who ends up investigating a murder in which her friend, who performs performs in drag at this nightclub is being framed, basically, so she knows he's innocent and she needs to clear his name. And it just sounds so precisely up my alley, like young adult historical fiction, queer historical fiction, bisexual main character, lady detective main character. Like, I'm really expecting this book to be amazing. Along similar lines, question number 4 is your most anticipated release for the second half of the year. And again, I feel like I don't have a comprehensive enough knowledge of everything that's coming out in the second half of the year to be like, this is the one I'm most excited for. A highly anticipated release of mine for the second half of 2020 is The Love Curse of Melody McIntyre by Robin Talley. Again, a book that I'm mentioning because it really just seems like it possibly was written precisely for me. I've read a couple of books by Robin Talley before, and this book in particular is a queer rom-com about a young stage manager who has sworn off love because every time she gets a crush on someone she's working on a show with, the show and the romance both end in disaster, so she's sworn off love forever. And she's working on the school's production of Les Mis, but then she didn't count on like the new star actor being so cute and seeming to like have a crush on her, and what is she gonna do? Yeah, so we know that I love theater, we know that I like female-female romance, we know that I like rom-coms, and I trust Robin Talley to deliver a book that works as a book. So if the book can deliver on that premise is perfect for me. I'm totally sold. That comes out in December. Question number 5 is your biggest disappointment, and I've had a small handful of disappointments this year, but the one that I want to talk about and the one that was probably the worst disappointment was Recipe for a Perfect Wife by Karma Brown. This is pitched as sort of a dual timeline, half historical novel where two women separated by 50 years are living in the same house. The first woman, Nellie, is sort of a 1950s housewife, but she's having trouble with her marriage because her husband is basically an abusive butthead. And then the modern day woman moves into her house and discovers some papers and things from this 1950s woman's life, and she's just lost her job and she's like trying to get pregnant, but she's having trouble with her marriage too. The way it was pitched to me, it seemed like this modern day woman was going to become obsessed with the past woman's life and figuring out the mystery of her story or whatever. And basically that's not what happened. It didn't get psychological enough to be like a psychological thriller or dark enough to be like a thriller, and it wasn't really a mystery because she wasn't actively trying to solve any kind of a mystery. I think the author was trying to make some kind of a point about the expectations that we put on women, both within relationships and in general, by putting these two women and these two marriages in parallel, but I just don't think the point was skillfully made because she made the 1950s woman's situation and husband so terrible that they became not fairly comparable to the situation that the modern day woman was in. Basically, this was a premise that should have worked near perfectly for me, but the author really didn't deliver on the premise or any of the different ways that the premise could have played out successfully, and that was very disappointing to me. Okay, question 6 is biggest surprise, and I don't know if I have anything for this in like strict terms of like the opposite of a disappointment, a book you thought was going to be bad but that turned out to be really good. I don't think I have anything like that, but I will mention Verona Comics by Jennifer Dugan as an example of a book that I thought was going to be one thing but turned out to be very much another, and I liked the other thing that it was. So from the cover and the marketing, I thought Verona Comics was going to be a young adult rom-com, when in fact it's actually a pretty serious investigation of boundaries and codependency in teen relationships, which I think makes it a retelling that investigates Romeo and Juliet, on which it's based, way more interestingly than any other Romeo and Juliet retelling that I've ever read. So that was a surprise. And the other book I'm going to mention is The Last Time I Lied by Riley Sager, because right before I started this book, I was like, I'm in the mood to read a thriller, but like, do I ever give thrillers more than like 3 or 3.5 stars? Like, is it possible for a thriller to get more than 3.5 stars from me, or do I just not like them that much? And then I read The Last Time I Lied and I was like, oh, that is a solid 4-star book, like at least. That was good. That was really well done. So it was just funny that I set up an expectation for myself that like thrillers are 3 stars, and then this one came and proved me wrong immediately. Question 7 is your favorite new author, whether that be a debut or just a new to you author. And this is another one that I sort of had a hard time answering because I haven't really read multiple books from one author that weren't within one series. So I would say the criteria for really establishing anyone as a new favorite author have not been met, just in terms of my exposure to their work this year. But with that said, I have a few people that I would like to mention. First, I want to mention Kylie Reid, who wrote Such a Fun Age, which I just think was an extremely strong debut novel. It's really fluidly written, it's really easy to get through, but at the same time, it is dealing authentically and seriously with real substantial issues. It's basically a book about racial microaggressions and white people using a Black woman in their lives to try to convince themselves and everyone else that they are not racist and that they are good people. And basically, I just think that, especially considering that this is a debut novel, the writing is extremely strong, the plotting was extremely strong. It reminded me, as I said in my review, of White Teeth by Zadie Smith. So if Zadie Smith's career trajectory based on that debut is anything to go off of, I expect Kylie Reid is going to have an impressive career trajectory as well. And next up, I wanted to mention Lyssa Kay Adams, who writes the Bromance Book Club series, which I've read multiple books in this year, and I am anticipating the release of the third one. And I wanted to put this out here because this was the first time that I read a romance novel, like a genre romance novel, and got that emotionally involved with the characters. I think, like, I was really rooting for the characters. And then I was wondering if it was a one-off thing, but I read the sequel, Undercover Bromance, and she seems to be able to make me really care. So in addition to her romances being really enjoyable and fun and fluffy and sweet, I get really emotionally invested in the relationships, which I think is the point of reading romance. So yeah, she's doing a good job. Wanted to shout her out. And then finally, I wanted to mention Lindy West. I listened to Shrill Notes from a Loud Woman on audiobook back at the beginning of the year, and I wanted to mention her for this question because while I was listening to the book, I could 100% tell that West is a writer by trade, just the way that she was writing sentences and paragraphs. It wasn't obtrusive or anything, it was all very natural, but I would be listening and be like, damn, she can write, like, she can write. So since the question is favorite author, I figured I would bring her up because her skill level basically is very high. That is another book that made me cry while I was driving. Question number 8 is newest fictional crush. And again, I feel like I'm disclaiming all of these questions, but like, I don't really do that. I don't really get crushes on fictional characters or book characters. Like, that's not really a thing. It's not really how this works. But if I were going to pick something approximate, I would pick both Mac and Liz from You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. I'm aware that both of these people are in high school, they're high school seniors, so I'm not saying, again, this is not a real crush. This isn't like if they were real people, I would try to get with them. It's just like the way Leah Johnson describes Mac with like the red hair and like the dandelion tattoo behind her ear and like the art student vibe, like it was very much my type, just like objectively speaking. And then Liz, we're inside her perspective for the duration of the whole book, and it really just made me want to like give her a hug and like make sure no harm ever comes to her, because she was just such a sweet, good character who deserved good things. So neither of those things is a real crush. I don't want it to be creepy, but both of those two characters from that book are delightful rays of sunshine, and they deserve good things. Question number 9 is newest favorite character, and for this I probably should say Jack from the Wayward Children series. Again, I don't think I've ever fallen in love with a character that fast, but because I've already talked about that, I also wanted to bring up Cassandra from I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. Again, this is a book that is told in the first person, so we get a very strong voice from Cassandra, who is our narrator, who is ostensibly writing down all the events that happen in her diary to develop her writing skills, and something about reading from her perspective just made me feel so beautifully nostalgic, something in the way that she is so naive but also a little bit pretentious, the way that she has these really big feelings but she doesn't know what to do with them yet. And one of my favorite things about her is that throughout the novel she doubts almost everything else, but she never doubts that she is a writer and that she will be a great writer someday. She just has this sort of irrepressible will to create and to use her voice. This is just a really sweet book, and so much of the sweetness comes from Cassandra's voice. Question number 10 is a book that made you cry, and quite frankly, I've cried at quite a few books this year, but the book that made me cry the most was Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. This is a book about a Chinese-American family in the 1970s, and one day their favorite child goes missing and then her body turns up in a lake in the neighborhood, and the rest of the book is basically about the fallout from that, everything that led up to it, and everything that happens after. This is a devastating book. It's about a dead 14-year-old. That's not a spoiler, that's what happens on the first page. But it's about the grief of that and what you do with all of these expectations for a life that's never going to be lived. And it was very sad, and I sobbed through probably like the last 30 pages of it straight. The next question is a book that made you happy, and there are, of course, lots of answers to this. Lots of books have made me happy, but I want to shout out a book that I haven't talked about much since I read it, and that is The Downstairs Girl by Stacey Lee. This is a young adult historical fiction set in the Reconstruction era South and following a young Chinese American girl who loses her position at a milliner's, and so she goes back to work as a house servant on this one estate. But at night and sort of on the sly, she is also writing an advice column, a very progressive and humorous advice column advocating for women's rights and the rights of racial minorities and etc. And there's really just so much going on in this novel that it's hard to summarize accurately. It's a book about the families we make for ourselves. It's a book about a young woman using her voice in a society that is constantly telling her not to do that, and it is about the intersections of race and class and gender. Honestly, I kind of feel like this book has it all. It has an endearing main character. It has a very, very well-crafted plot. It has fluid, atmospheric writing. I really, really enjoyed it, and it made me happy while I was reading it. Question number 12 is the most beautiful book you have bought or received this year. Now, you know I don't buy a lot of books. I think I've only gone book shopping twice this year, and one of those was a used book sale where I basically picked up a bunch of classics that were very nice to have, but not particularly aesthetically pleasing to look at. But I will shout out a few, I guess, nice looking books. I Capture the Castle from that used book sale, and I think this is a pretty nice cover. I think it's, pleasing, and it's very clean and in good condition for a used book sale. I also got This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Motar and Max Gladstone, which the cover is nice. And then I think my favorite book that I've purchased this year in terms of aesthetic is Cleopatra: A Life by Stacy Schiff. I also got this one from the used book sale, and it's pretty nice looking, if I do say so myself. It's pretty nice looking. But honestly, aesthetically speaking, none of the books that I've purchased this year have blown me away. I think there are books with prettier covers that I've read, but that I read in ebook and never owned at all. And finally, question 13 is, what books do you need to read by the end of the year? And there are a bunch. There are a lot of books that I need to read by the end of the year. Speaking in terms of my New Year's resolutions, my bookish goals for the year, I need to read the rest of my 10 for the 20s TBR, which is 9 books. I need to read a whole bunch more plays, because the whole purpose of setting that goal was to make play reading a part of my weekly routine, something that happened regularly without me having to think about it too much, and that certainly has not occurred yet, so I need to read a bunch more plays and make that a habit. Again, specifically in terms of New Year's resolutions, I need to read a personal finance book specifically targeted towards freelancers, and a zero waste or low waste book, a book about reducing the amount of waste your household puts out. In terms of getting my life together and getting my career off to a good start, I sort of feel a pressing need to get to The Multi-Hyphen Method by Emma Gannon and Range by David Epstein, which are both about people who don't just want to specialize, people who want to do more than one thing as their career or in their life, which describes me pretty well. I have broad interests, I'm interested in a lot of things, and if I had my druthers, I would pursue a lot of things at the same time. So I promised my boyfriend that I would read The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas as soon as Jane Austen July was over. This is a pretty chunky book. I'm a little bit intimidated. This edition looks to be about 1,400 pages, and I think my personal record for a single book is only 900 pages, so this will definitely stretch me a little bit. Yes, but I did make a promise to read this year. Before the end of the year, I also really want to get to Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. I first read the Odyssey 4 years ago in 2016, and then in 2018, I read a different translation of the Odyssey, and at that time I was like, wouldn't it be cool if I read a new translation of the Odyssey every 2 years or so? So we're due for that again. It's 2020, and I have a particular interest in that translation because Emily Wilson is the first woman to publish a translation of the Odyssey, and as I'm sure you've heard by now, if you run in those sorts of circles, if you care about these sorts of things, she does some interesting things with the translation that expose gender bias in other translations that was sort of pretending to be objectivity, if that sentence made sense. She exposes previously hidden gender bias that was on the part of the previous translators, not necessarily the text itself, is my understanding of the project of the translation. That all sounds very interesting to me. Also, before the end of the year, I would like to get to If Not Winter, Fragments of Sappho, translated by Anne Carson. Honestly, I could keep going about things that I want to read before the end of the year. I think that was a very helpful question for me because it helped get me sort of excited about reading again. Really quickly, I also wanted to give some shout outs to books that I have loved in the first half of this year, but that I wasn't able to make fit for any of the questions. I'm just going to do some really rapid fire style recommendations. If you're looking for a queer Shakespeare retelling, I really recommend The Last True Poets of the Sea by Julia Julia Drake. If you are looking for a really excellent young adult contemporary, I recommend With the Fire on High by Elizabeth Acevedo. If you are looking for a play, the best play I have read so far this year is The Understudy by Teresa Rebeck. Again, it doesn't really have a lot of competition because I haven't read that many plays, and a lot of the plays that I have read were utter garbage. But I love everything that I've read by Teresa Rebeck so far, and this is a play about theater people, and I really just found it delightful. And then finally, if you want a really haunting, melancholy, literary, dystopian science fiction book, I recommend The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. Okay, and that is it. That is the mid-year book Freakout tag. Let me know in the comments down below what you really need to get read by the end of the year, or what your most anticipated new release for the second half of 2020 is, because I would love to know. Tell me what you're excited for. And if you enjoy this, I do hope you will consider subscribing, and I will see you again soon. But in the meantime, I hope that everybody is staying happy, healthy, and safe, and I hope that somewhere out there is a great book waiting just for you. Bye!